the examiner. Hunsaker believes Menzies is playing into that diagnosis.
First to take the stand was the mother of the victim, Diane, citing that Kathryn spoke with a divorce attorney.
On the surface, Matthew Restelli's life was settling. A 8-year-old father from California. He was in the middle of a contentious separation from his wife, Kathryn Restelli. But in the summer of 2024, something changed. Kathryn invited him to Utah, claiming she needed urgent help. She was now staying at her mother's home in American Fork with their daughter. Her tone was urgent, but oddly civil. After all the months of distance, suddenly, she was calling him Matt again. What Matthew didn't know was that his wife wasn't the only one waiting for him that day. Inside that suburban Utah home, a trap was set. Matthew rushed across state lines, unaware that his former in-laws were preparing more than a conversation. By the time he walked through the door, the plan was already in motion. Within minutes, he would be stabbed in the arm, then shot in the chest. And someone would try to make it all look like self-defense. But the evidence wouldn't cooperate. This is not just the story of a man killed. It's the story of a murder that was staged like a play, a conspiracy that unraveled because of one overlooked detail, a knife planted in the wrong hand. Welcome to Echoes of the Court. This is the case of Matthew Restelli and the deadly web of family betrayal. In divorce law, physical presence can matter. Custody, court jurisdiction, emergency orders. For Kathryn Restelli, getting Matthew to Utah wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. According to prosecutors, Kathryn, her brother Kevin Ellis, and her mother Tracey Grist had a plan. Lure Matthew across state lines and neutralize him before any court could grant him parental rights or force Kathryn back to California. In the days leading up to the shooting, Kathryn reached out with surprising warmth. She wanted Matthew to visit. She needed help with their daughter. She insisted it was safe. No lawyers. No fighting. Just talk. What she didn't tell him was that her brother Kevin would be there too armed, and their mother Tracey had been researching criminal cases. Not random ones either. Ones involving family murder plots, custody battles, and the fine print of interstate parental kidnapping. The day Matthew arrived, he texted friends that he was hopeful. He walked into that house willingly. He carried nothing but his phone and his fatherly concern. But the moment he stepped inside, he was stabbed in the forearm, then shot in the chest by Kevin Ellis, who later told police, "I thought he was going to kill us." Police initially considered the self-defense claim. A man stabbed, a knife, a single gunshot. But something felt wrong. Matthew was right-handed. The knife was planted in his left. And the blood spatter didn't match the story. Inside that living room, the truth would begin to leak out slowly. And then, all at once, the 911 call was calm. Too calm. Kevin Ellis told the dispatcher that he had shot a man who was attacking his sister. He described a struggle, a knife, and a chaotic moment of life or death judgment. Officers arrived to find Matthew Restelli lying on the floor, already dead. But detectives weren't buying it. The scene looked wrong. The blood pattern on the floor suggested Matthew had been standing still, not lunging. There were no defensive wounds on Kathryn or Kevin. And then there was the knife, placed neatly in Matthew's left hand. An odd detail, considering Matthew was known to be right-handed. Autopsy results raised more questions. The stab wound to Matthew's arm was shallow, superficial, even. But the gunshot was center mass, fatal, direct, and fired from several feet away. Officers quickly obtained a search warrant for the house. What they found changed everything. In Tracey Grist's browser history were dozens of searches. How to win custody across state lines. Can you shoot someone to protect a sibling? And chillingly, Dan Markle case breakdown. That last one referenced the murder of a father during a custody battle, one of the most notorious hit plots in recent memory. Investigators began piecing it together. Kathryn had wanted to avoid a legal fight. Tracey had been preparing for this scenario. Kevin had pulled the trigger. 3 people, 1 victim, and a story falling apart. As pressure mounted, the family's united front began to crack. Investigators leaned into the digital trail. Messages between Kathryn and Kevin, deleted phone logs, even shared calendar entries that pointed to coordinated timing. But it wasn't until Kathryn Restelli agreed to talk that the full picture emerged. On the 17th of July, 2025, In a Utah courtroom packed with silent tension, Kathryn pleaded guilty to 3 felony charges: second-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and use of a firearm. It was a staggering reversal. Just months earlier, she had stood behind Kevin's story claiming self-defense. Now, she admitted it was all a lie. Kathryn told the court that she had lured Matthew to the house, that the plan was to confront him, to scare him into submission, but things got out of hand. She said Kevin overreacted, and that her mother Tracey had helped cover it up. She even admitted they had practiced parts of the story beforehand. She wasn't just testifying for herself. She agreed to testify against her own mother and brother. Kathryn's plea deal would allow her to avoid a life sentence. She faces 6 years to life, with sentencing scheduled for the 9th of September, 2025. Prosecutors defended the deal, saying her cooperation was key to unraveling the rest of the conspiracy. But for many, the idea that she could walk free someday was a bitter pill. A woman who orchestrated her estranged husband's death getting a chance at parole. Still, her confession cracked the case wide open and left her family scrambling. With Kathryn Restelli now cooperating with the state, the spotlight shifted to the remaining 2 defendants: her brother, Kevin Ellis, and her mother, Tracey Grist. Both were charged with aggravated murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of domestic violence in the presence of a child, since Kathryn and Matthew's daughter had been in the home at the time of the shooting. Kevin Ellis, the man who pulled the trigger, refused to change his story. He maintained that he acted in defense of his sister and niece, that Matthew was out of control, that the stabbing was real. But with Kathryn's testimony looming, and the forensic evidence contradicting his version of events, Kevin's defense began to look fragile. Then came Tracey. A former schoolteacher and respected community member, she had no prior criminal record, but prosecutors believed she was the mastermind. It was Tracey who had invited Kathryn to live with her during the separation. Tracey who had researched legal custody strategies online. Tracey who had read about the Dan Markel case, a murder committed during a custody dispute, where the killers tried to avoid suspicion by using a family intermediary. It was all too familiar. And though Tracey claimed innocence, the timing of her searches, her texts to Kathryn in the days before the shooting, and her presence during the act told a different story. In a pretrial hearing, the judge ruled that both Kevin and Tracey would stand trial, noting that the evidence suggested a coordinated and premeditated action carried out by all 3 defendants. The trial is set to begin in January 2026, expected to last 5 weeks, but there's one twist that could seal their fate. Kathryn is now the prosecution's star witness. She will testify against her mother. She will testify against her brother. And the jury will be asked to decide whether this was a crime of passion or a family murder pact. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic confession or a smoking gun that broke the Restelli case wide open. It was a mistake, a small, almost laughably simple detail. The knife was in the wrong hand. Matthew Restelli was right-handed. The knife was planted in his left. That single oversight unraveled a plan that, on paper, had layers of manipulation, legal maneuvering, and staged chaos. The Restelli killing wasn't spontaneous, it was curated. The false narrative of self-defense. The shallow knife wound meant to justify lethal force. The last-minute calls to 911. The careful planting of a weapon. It all read like a poorly directed play. But investigators were watching closely. They traced the timing of phone calls and messages between Kathryn, Kevin, and Tracey. They recovered search histories about interstate custody law, famous murder cases, and the consequences of justifiable homicide. They read texts where Tracey urged her daughter not to return to California. They pieced together GPS logs showing Kevin's arrival at the home precisely when Matthew was scheduled to visit. And now, they had the one thing conspiracy cases rarely get: an insider willing to testify. Kathryn's decision to cooperate transformed the investigation from a tangled mess of circumstantial evidence into a clear, prosecutable case. With her admission, the illusion of a spontaneous, defensive act evaporated. What remained was chilling: a mother, daughter, and son conspiring together to take the life of a man who simply wanted to co-parent his child. The question now is not whether they killed Matthew Restelli. It's how much prison time they'll serve for it. In death, Matthew Restelli became more than a victim, he became a warning. His murder is a case study in how domestic conflict can metastasize into something far more sinister. It wasn't just a failed marriage or a bitter custody fight. It was a conspiracy, incubated inside a family, fueled by paranoia, control, and a belief that the law could be outmaneuvered with lies and blood. The legal consequences are still unfolding. Kathryn Restelli awaits sentencing, facing anywhere from 6 years to life, depending on her cooperation and the judge's ruling this September. She will likely be the state's key witness in the upcoming trial against her mother and brother. Kevin Ellis and Tracey Grist, once silent pillars behind the scenes, are now at the center of a criminal prosecution that could define the rest of their lives. If convicted, both face life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for Matthew's family, the ones not tied to this betrayal, the damage is permanent. His daughter, still just a child, was in the home when he died. She lost a father to murder and a mother to the prison system. She will grow up with court transcripts instead of bedtime stories, and her family tree now includes a conspiracy diagram. And the rest of us? We're left to ask the same haunting questions that prosecutors asked the jury. How far will people go to win a custody battle? At what point does fear become pretext? And can justice ever fully repair what betrayal breaks? In the courtroom, evidence tells the story. But in the aftermath, it's the silence that lingers longest. This is the case of Matthew Restelli. This is Echoes of the Court.